So, Princess Anne has finally, publicly put a definitive name to the toxic thing absolutely everyone inside the palace has been nervously whispering about for months. And it is absolutely not just another petty family argument over protocol or precedence. It is a highly specific, damning document. One single sentence, heavily underlined twice, sitting quietly in a restricted folder that apparently definitively explains exactly why Prince William and Catherine absolutely aren't just annoyed with Queen Camilla, they are completely, irrevocably done. And when Anne deliberately placed that explosive folder directly on the mahogany table, William reportedly absolutely wouldn't even look at Camilla's name printed on it. That is absolutely not mere tension. That is a massive, impenetrable wall violently going up in real time. The real story here absolutely isn't that they had a messy, emotional fight. The massive constitutional story is that Camilla's private office was allegedly systematically using King Charles's name and sovereign authority to aggressively push through massive decisions he absolutely never actually saw or approved, and William and Catherine finally figured the entire scheme out. That is the absolute core of the betrayal, and once you clearly see the undeniable pattern Princess Anne painstakingly laid out, it is completely impossible to unsee it. Before we go any further into the weeds, if you are genuinely into deep dives concerning royal power plays and palace intrigue, hit subscribe to my channel. We meticulously break this stuff down exactly as it happens behind closed doors. Okay, let's get into the details of the confrontation. The meeting itself started completely without any big theatrical drama. Princess Anne sat there calmly, with William and Catherine seated rigidly beside her, and she had a thick file resting under her hand. She explicitly stated that the working relationship with Camilla absolutely didn't collapse overnight. William had stoically tolerated repeated, aggressive interference from her office, specifically to protect Charles, and clearly stated that Camilla routinely presented her own personal wishes to staff exactly as if they were direct, non-negotiable instructions from King Charles. Senior aides were heavily pressured to completely bypass William's office. Massive ceremonial decisions were quietly changed before Catherine could even officially object to them. Every single message from Camilla's camp carried the exact same implicit warning. The king explicitly wanted it. The king personally approved it. Absolute cooperation was expected immediately. They believed that respectfully stepping back would protect Charles's fragile reign. Instead, their polite silence created a massive opening for exploitation. The very first clear warning sign appeared months earlier. A crucial senior appointment carefully chosen by William's household was abruptly delayed after Camilla's office falsely claimed Charles specifically wanted greater coordination across the households. William politely accepted the bureaucratic explanation. Then another abrupt instruction arrived regarding an entirely different subject, using the exact same wording, applying the exact same pressure, but bearing absolutely no direct, written approval from the king. One highly experienced aide astutely noticed the pattern. Several highly disputed messages had absolutely not passed through Charles's private office at all. They moved directly from Camilla's household to senior staff, while falsely carrying the heavy weight of royal authority. That distinction matters significantly more than most people realize. A simple suggestion from Camilla could absolutely be questioned by staff. A direct order from the reigning king absolutely could not. Catherine eventually raised one highly altered arrangement directly with Charles in private. She fully expected him to defend the change he supposedly ordered. Instead, he looked completely confused. He had absolutely never seen the specific request. He had absolutely never approved the restrictive language. He genuinely did not know exactly why his name had been attached to it. That specific moment is exactly where absolutely everything pivots. William was absolutely no longer facing an over-involved, annoying stepmother merely offering unsolicited advice. He was suddenly confronting a massive, rogue system where his father's supreme authority could be actively hijacked and used to silence the heir to the throne. Catherine understood something infinitely more painful. Her previous objections had been ruthlessly dismissed, specifically because resistance to Camilla's office falsely looked exactly like blatant disobedience to the king himself. Still, she didn't aggressively confront Camilla publicly. She wanted undeniable proof, names, specific dates, original written instructions. Anne later quietly said that incredible restraint was the absolute last kindness Catherine ever offered. It ended abruptly when a highly protected arrangement, specifically involving Princess Charlotte, was quietly, aggressively rewritten, despite Queen Elizabeth's clear, documented historical wishes regarding the Wales children. Catherine formally objected inside a closed, restricted palace meeting. Camilla coldly dismissed her valid concern directly in front of senior officials and forcefully insisted the controversial change accurately reflected the king's final decision. Catherine said absolutely nothing more in the room. She simply stood up, left, and immediately contacted Charles directly herself. He had absolutely never approved it. That was the final, unhealable break. But even the shocking Charlotte incident wasn't the full, terrifying story. The explosive document resting directly beneath Anne's hand clearly showed that Camilla's rogue requests reached far beyond mere staffing, ceremonies, and one child's position. They aggressively reached directly into Queen Elizabeth's highly private legacy and directly toward massive decisions entirely reserved for William's own future reign. Anne had deliberately underlined exactly one sentence twice. Before she revealed it to the room, she sternly warned that the specific words would clearly explain exactly why William and Catherine absolutely no longer believed Camilla wanted cooperation. They firmly believed she wanted absolute control. According to Anne's meticulous account, the very first disputed instruction seemed relatively harmless on the surface. In May 2023, mere months after Charles finally settled onto the throne, William's household carefully selected a top aide to coordinate his rapidly expanding public duties. The appointment had flawlessly passed internal checks, all references were complete, and high-level security clearance was moving forward. Then the entire process abruptly stopped. A formal message arrived from Camilla's office, explicitly stating the king demanded greater coordination before absolutely any senior appointment was confirmed. The wording was highly polite, but the ultimate effect was absolute paralysis. Absolutely no one wanted to be accused of actively resisting Charles's wishes. William dutifully accepted the delay, even though the decision concerned his own private staff. Catherine, however, noticed something else entirely. The delay request carried absolutely no attached note from Charles. Absolutely no private secretary from the king's office had attached formal approval. Absolutely no date showed exactly when the king had supposedly reviewed the appointment. It simply arrived with his massive authority assumed by Camilla's staff. William still bravely chose patience. He deeply understood the immense pressure currently on his father. Charles was desperately trying to reduce public confusion, calm bitter internal rivalries, and carefully create the appearance of a streamlined, smaller monarchy. A delayed staff appointment simply didn't seem worth igniting a massive family dispute, so the Wales household respectfully stepped back. That specific, compliant decision would be repeatedly exploited. By October 2024, yet another strict instruction reached William's team. This time it specifically concerned exactly how visible responsibilities would be divided during a massive ceremonial event. A highly visible role assigned to one of William's key aides had been abruptly transferred to someone directly connected to Camilla's household. Again, the provided explanation was exactly the same. The king explicitly wanted consistency. The king explicitly wished to avoid competing offices. The king fully expected the sudden change to be accepted immediately. And again, there was absolutely no signature from Charles. One highly experienced, suspicious aide immediately began keeping exact copies of absolutely everything. Every single email, every single revised schedule, every single note that explicitly used Charles's name, entirely without actually showing his written approval. At first, the growing file merely looked like routine, messy administration. Then the exact same specific phrases started appearing entirely too often. Greater coordination, unified direction, final approval strictly through the Queen's household. The toxic pattern was rapidly becoming highly visible. Different, massive decisions were constantly being changed, but the ultimate advantage absolutely always moved in exactly one direction. Camilla's office relentlessly gained access and power. William's staff continuously lost control and autonomy. Catherine was fully expected to accept absolutely each and every alteration quietly because questioning the change could instantly be presented to Charles as aggressively questioning the king himself. That was the brilliant, suffocating trap. In June 2025, the immense pressure moved directly from minor staffing into highly visible ceremony. William had formally approved the complex seating and procession plan for a massive event involving all senior royals. The massive arrangement was inexplicably changed almost immediately after it left his secure office. Catherine's formal position remained publicly respectable but highly practical. Behind-the-scenes decisions were entirely shifted away from her team. She politely asked why. The response came back incredibly quickly. Charles specifically preferred the revised plan. Catherine absolutely did not challenge the message in writing. She patiently waited until she could speak with Charles entirely privately. The resulting conversation was incredibly calm, almost entirely ordinary. She casually mentioned the massive alteration and asked whether he had specific concerns about the original arrangement. Charles looked at her, exactly as if she had raised a completely wrong foreign document. He had absolutely not reviewed it. He had absolutely not requested a massive change. He had absolutely not been told that his name had been actively used to enforce it. For Catherine, that specific chilling moment carried infinitely more weight than absolutely any public disagreement ever could. The massive problem was absolutely no longer simply difficult communication between two rival households. Someone highly placed had discovered that casually dropping Charles's name could instantly end an argument before it even began. William was explicitly told that very night. His immediate first reaction was absolute disbelief, then cold anger, then absolute control. He absolutely did not confront Camilla. He immediately, secretly ordered his staff to trace absolutely every single instruction that had been falsely presented to them as the king's explicit wish. The intense review was narrow at first. It examined appointment delays, heavily altered schedules, manipulated guest lists, ceremonial notes, and heavily restricted access to records linked to Queen Elizabeth's private legacy. What emerged from the review was absolutely not one rogue order. It was a massive, documented chain of small, calculated interventions, each incredibly easy to excuse on its own, each incredibly difficult to challenge without causing a scene, and each leaving Camilla's office with significantly more unchecked influence. One specific, terrifying message stood out. It directed senior staff to strictly seek approval directly through the Queen's household before briefing William on a highly sensitive matter connected to Elizabeth's private records. That specific instruction absolutely did not simply bypass him. It deliberately placed Camilla's office directly between the future king and massive decisions intimately tied to his own grandmother's legacy. William furiously wanted an explanation. Catherine demanded proof. Anne would later definitively say this was the exact point when the couple completely stopped treating the massive issue as a petty family irritation and began aggressively examining it as a deliberate, hostile pattern. Still, Catherine bravely resisted open confrontation. She intimately knew exactly what would happen if the bitter dispute leaked to the press. The complex story would instantly become just another petty royal feud. Camilla would be sympathetically portrayed as a misunderstood victim. William would be aggressively accused of impatience for the throne. Catherine would be unfairly blamed for creating division. So, she waited for the perfect moment. Then, in early February 2026, a highly restricted planning document arrived at the Wales household. Most of it looked entirely familiar. Basic timings, specific entrances, seating positions, standard staff assignments. But exactly one highly significant name had been moved. Princess Charlotte. The specific change was incredibly small enough to easily escape casual attention, yet highly serious enough to directly violate a specific arrangement Queen Elizabeth had personally, fiercely protected. Catherine read the page twice in disbelief. Then she saw exactly which office had explicitly requested the revision, and an upcoming meeting was rapidly approaching. This time, polite silence would absolutely not protect anyone. The explosive meeting began on February 17, 2026, at Buckingham Palace. Absolutely no cameras, absolutely no press. Only senior officials and key household representatives expected to formally approve the massive arrangement before it was permanently locked into place. Catherine arrived with exactly one burning concern. Princess Charlotte's highly visible position had been deliberately moved. The change certainly looked minor on paper. One tiny line shifted, one name placed beneath another, yet the underlying meaning was completely unmistakable. Charlotte would absolutely no longer remain within the immediate, highly visible Wales grouping during the massive event. She would be redirected into a significantly secondary position directly controlled by Camilla's household staff. That was absolutely not what Queen Elizabeth had previously approved. Years earlier, Elizabeth had made her absolute preference incredibly clear. The Wales children were to remain strictly under their parents' direct, protective guidance whenever their public appearance carried immense constitutional meaning. It was absolutely not simply about exactly where a child stood. It was entirely about exactly who had the absolute right to decide. Catherine calmly opened the original plan directly beside the heavily revised version. The room grew entirely still. The immense tension became unmistakable. She absolutely did not raise her voice. She pointed directly to the alteration and asked precisely why her daughter's position had been changed entirely without consultation. A senior private secretary lowered his eyes. Absolutely no one answered her. Then Camilla's explanation finally came. The revision accurately reflected the king's explicit wishes. That specific sentence was deliberately designed to instantly close the matter. Catherine deeply understood exactly what it meant. Absolutely any further objection could easily be framed as open resistance to Charles, not a simple disagreement with Camilla, not valid concern for Charlotte, but blatant disobedience to the monarch himself. Still, Catherine utterly refused to move past it. She asked pointedly whether Charles had personally, explicitly reviewed the page, whether the decision had been thoroughly discussed, and whether the household had been properly informed. The arrangement supposedly reflected the broader direction of the reign, but that was absolutely not an answer. Had Charles explicitly approved the change himself? Camilla completely failed to provide a signature, a written note, or absolutely any message from his private office. Instead, she coldly dismissed Catherine's completely valid concern as highly emotional and aggressively suggested that massive ceremonial decisions absolutely could not be shaped around one mother's petty preference. The harsh words landed incredibly hard. Charlotte was absolutely not being discussed respectfully as a princess. She was being coldly treated as leverage. Catherine's absolute authority as her mother was brutally reduced to mere sentiment, while Camilla's preference was falsely presented as absolute royal necessity. Absolutely everyone in that room understood the dynamic. Absolutely no one interrupted. Catherine slowly closed the folder. That silence was absolutely not a surrender. She absolutely did not argue because she absolutely no longer trusted anyone in the room. Absolutely anything she said could easily be repeated differently to the press. Any valid anger could be immediately weaponized against her. So, she remained flawlessly controlled, thanked the terrified officials, and left the room. Camilla arrogantly believed the matter was completely settled. It absolutely was not. Within the exact same hour, Catherine contacted Charles directly. The question was incredibly simple. Had he explicitly ordered Charlotte's position to be changed? Charles absolutely had not. He absolutely had not reviewed the revised plan. He absolutely had not instructed anyone to move Charlotte. He absolutely had not authorized his name to be used to silence Catherine's objection. The answer confirmed absolutely everything. This was absolutely no petty misunderstanding between rival households. It was a direct, fraudulent use of the king's supreme authority, entirely without the king's approval. William received the devastating details later that day. He read both versions of the plan, then carefully read the notes. What truly angered him the most was absolutely not the altered position itself. It was the ruthless method. Catherine had been deliberately made to look totally unreasonable before senior officials. Her entirely valid concern for Charlotte had been brutally dismissed, and the fraudulent decision had been fiercely protected by a claim Charles later entirely denied. William clearly saw the massive trap. If Catherine passively accepted the change, Camilla's office permanently gained control over their children. If Catherine openly objected, she could be easily accused of actively challenging the king. Absolutely either outcome significantly weakened the Wales household. That was entirely deliberate. William absolutely did not call Camilla. He did something infinitely more serious and devastating. He formally ordered a massive, full review of absolutely every single decision that had ever reached his household, falsely bearing Charles's approval. Dates were meticulously matched, complex routes were traced, terrified private secretaries were questioned, and countless instructions were rigorously compared directly with the king's actual schedule and briefing records. The devastating result was infinitely worse than they expected. Some massive messages had reached senior staff on days when Charles had absolutely never even seen the relevant documents. Others extensively used specific phrases entirely absent from his own office's correspondence. Several massive decisions had been completely finalized long before William was even formally informed. Catherine had strongly suspected interference. William now saw a massive, coordinated system. Once the massive review began, terrified officials started speaking out. One bravely admitted that questioning Camilla's office had become completely impossible because absolutely every single request was aggressively presented as a vital part of the king's wider plan. Another revealed that staff had been explicitly told to deliberately avoid giving William full, accurate details until massive decisions were nearly complete. Then one highly significant name surfaced: Princess Anne. Anne had already heard about the explosive meeting, absolutely not from William, absolutely not from Catherine, but from a terrified official who had been physically inside the room and absolutely could no longer pretend the toxic exchange was normal. She immediately asked for the original plan, then the revision, then absolutely every single note attached to it. By the very next morning, Anne had already begun meticulously comparing those papers directly with Queen Elizabeth's highly protected instructions. What she found clearly showed that Charlotte's altered position was absolutely not the end of the line. It was merely the tip of the iceberg, evidence of something infinitely much larger, and Anne was already physically holding the devastating document that would expose it completely. Anne absolutely did not rush to emotionally confront anyone. That was absolutely never her style. She began methodically with the paper trail. The original, protected instructions from Queen Elizabeth were securely stored in deep records at Windsor. They were absolutely not dramatic documents, no grand, sweeping declarations, just precise language about absolute continuity, immense responsibility, and the strict protection of arrangements involving the Wales children and the late Queen's highly private legacy. Anne meticulously read every single page. Then she deliberately placed the brand new correspondence directly beside it. The glaring differences were absolutely immediate. Elizabeth's specific instructions kept absolute authority incredibly close to William and Catherine whenever massive decisions actively involved their children, their household, or heavy duties connected to the future reign. The newer, forged papers completely moved that massive authority outward. Staff were explicitly told to seek approval elsewhere. Massive ceremonial positions could supposedly be adjusted entirely without direct consultation. Absolute access to highly private legacy records was directed to pass entirely through Camilla's office long before briefing William. It was absolutely not one minor change. It was a massive, silent transfer of power. Anne sharply asked exactly who had drafted the language. The answer came incredibly slowly. Several offices had contributed, but exactly one specific memorandum had fundamentally shaped the entire direction. It was incredibly blandly titled Household Continuity and Coordination. The name sounded entirely harmless, administrative, almost completely dull. That was exactly the brilliant disguise. The massive memorandum had been circulated on March 18, 2026, under highly restricted distribution. Only the absolute most senior aides had received the full, unredacted version. William's household had been deliberately given a significantly shortened copy, with incredibly key, dangerous paragraphs completely removed. Anne demanded the complete file. There was massive hesitation from staff. She demanded it again. By evening, the explosive document was resting on her desk. The very first pages dealt with tedious staffing. They aggressively proposed that absolutely all senior appointments connected to William's rapidly growing duties should be strictly reviewed through a central household structure, meaning Camilla's office. The next section concerned highly visible ceremonial presentation. It heavily recommended that absolute final placement decisions should permanently remain under the Queen's office whenever there was absolutely any disagreement. Then, the language drastically changed. The massive memorandum moved directly into controlling Queen Elizabeth's highly private legacy. It aggressively requested total access to sealed records, deeply personal correspondence, and massive arrangements that had been deliberately left under separate, ironclad protection. The sole reason given was continuity. Anne absolutely did not accept that word. True continuity should perfectly preserve a decision. This specific document appeared explicitly designed to completely replace one. She turned another page. There, the actual future became the primary subject. The massive proposal absolutely did not limit itself to Charles's current reign. It extensively discussed the critical period in which William would inevitably receive significantly more authority, attend significantly more state meetings, and actively prepare for massive responsibilities that could absolutely no longer be delayed. Camilla's office was actively asking to remain heavily involved in massive matters that would eventually, naturally sit completely beyond its reach. That was exactly when Anne completely stopped reading as a concerned sister. She began reading as someone who deeply, intimately understood absolute power. The document explicitly described William and Catherine's household as difficult to coordinate. It aggressively warned that their independent decision-making could easily create massive public confusion. It explicitly suggested significantly stronger controls were desperately needed long before absolutely any formal transfer of authority occurred. The words were highly polished. The underlying meaning was absolutely not. Anne marked one damning paragraph, then another. Finally, she reached exactly one terrifying sentence near the very bottom and heavily underlined it twice. She absolutely did not call William immediately. First, she meticulously checked the digital routing history. A chilling, handwritten note explicitly instructed staff absolutely not to send the full draft to the Wales household until the new, restrictive structure had been completely agreed upon. Another damning notation clearly showed that one of Charles's senior private secretaries had explicitly asked for clarification, but absolutely never received the supporting file. The king himself had absolutely not been given the specific, full version that actually mattered. Anne now clearly saw exactly two completely different realities simultaneously moving through the palace. One sanitized version was shown to Charles, softened, reasonable, and framed entirely as innocent coordination. Another highly toxic version contained the significantly deeper request for absolute control and remained entirely inside a much smaller, highly ambitious circle. She finally contacted William that evening. The massive meeting took place highly securely at Windsor, entirely away from the leaky palace offices. Catherine was present. Absolutely no aides remained once Anne opened the folder. She deliberately showed them the title page first, then the restricted circulation list, then the damning handwritten instruction explicitly designed to withhold the complete draft from them. William read in absolute furious silence. Catherine closely watched his face before finally looking down at the pages herself. The horrific Charlotte incident had deeply wounded her. This explosive document explicitly explained exactly why it had happened. It had been a calculated test. If Catherine blindly accepted the change, the toxic method worked flawlessly. If she openly objected, she could instantly be described to the king as resistant and difficult. Absolutely either way, Camilla's office gained powerful evidence that the Wales household desperately needed much tighter control. Anne slowly turned to the final marked page. She did absolutely not read the sentence aloud. Not yet. Instead, she asked William exactly one piercing question. Had he ever explicitly agreed that his massive future authority should be actively supervised entirely through Camilla's household? The answer came incredibly quickly. No. Catherine's answer was significantly quieter. She had absolutely never even been asked. That was more than enough. Days later, inside the highly private interview room, Anne deliberately placed the exact same folder firmly on the table. William sat tensely beside Catherine, but absolutely neither reached for it. They already intimately knew exactly what it contained. The interviewer blindly asked whether Camilla had simply been trying to prevent massive disorder during a highly difficult transition. Anne looked down intently at the memorandum. Then she looked up. Stability, she stated coldly, absolutely did not require elaborate deception. True coordination absolutely did not require hiding full vital documents from the future king. Genuine respect absolutely did not involve publicly dismissing Catherine before senior officials while fraudulently using Charles's name entirely without proof. Her hand moved slowly toward the heavily underlined sentence. The interviewer nervously asked her to read it, and she paused. That exact sentence, she said firmly, was exactly why William and Catherine completely stopped believing Camilla wanted cooperation. It was also exactly why any true reconciliation had become absolutely impossible. Anne lifted her hand slowly from the page. Absolutely nobody spoke. William stared intensely at the underlined line. Catherine remained perfectly still. The interviewer waited in agony, sensing that the massive document had reached the exact point absolutely everyone had been brought there to hear. Then Anne read the sentence clearly. The Prince and Princess of Wales can be successfully managed until the formal transfer of authority is complete. Absolutely nothing in the room moved. The exact wording was incredibly calm, highly administrative, almost entirely bloodless, yet its underlying meaning struck infinitely harder than absolutely any open, screaming insult. William was absolutely not respectfully described as the future king. Catherine was absolutely not respectfully treated as the vital woman who would one day stand proudly beside him. They were clinically presented exactly as two troublesome people whose annoying resistance could be easily contained until massive power shifted entirely beyond Camilla's reach. For William, that single sentence completely changed the entire massive pattern. The delayed staff appointment, the maliciously altered ceremony, the hidden draft, Charlotte's terrifyingly changed position. Absolutely every single incident now appeared undeniably to lead directly toward the exact same objective. His massive future authority was absolutely not being respected as something already taking shape. It was being coldly treated exactly as a problem to violently control. That was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. William had spent long years intensely supporting Charles through the most massive transition of his life. He had dutifully accepted incredibly uncomfortable decisions, fiercely defended the monarchy during intense pressure, and desperately resisted igniting another messy family conflict. Yet, the explosive document explicitly suggested that his intense loyalty had been brutally interpreted exactly as weak permission to control him. Catherine read the exact same sentence entirely differently. She instantly saw every single room in which she had remained impeccably composed. Absolutely every objection she had politely softened. Absolutely every single time she had bravely chosen total silence, specifically to protect Charles from massive embarrassment. The massive memorandum made all those painful moments look significantly less like a desire for peace and vastly more like hard evidence that she could easily be pushed around. Charlotte's maliciously altered position had absolutely not been careless. It had been a highly calculated demonstration. Camilla's office had actively tested whether Catherine would meekly accept a massive change involving her own daughter once the king's name was falsely placed behind it. When Catherine bravely objected, her valid concern had been brutally dismissed as mere emotion. When she later horrifyingly discovered Charles had given absolutely no approval, the deep humiliation became utterly impossible to ever explain away. Anne decisively closed the folder. The massive evidence now had to reach Charles. The explosive meeting took place strictly behind closed doors. William attended firmly with Anne. Catherine deliberately chose not to enter. Her glaring absence carried its own massive, undeniable message. She absolutely no longer wanted yet another pointless discussion in which the massive seriousness of what happened could be easily softened into a mere misunderstanding. Charles was explicitly shown the full memorandum, absolutely not the heavily shortened version that had deceitfully reached his office. He read the marked, damning paragraph twice in disbelief. According to Anne's detailed account, his immediate reaction was incredibly clear.